Hello everyone, thanks for joining us today. We're going to start this event in about 3 minutes while we wait for people to join slowly. In the meantime, just so that we get started, I'm going to show you my face so that I'm not just some random voice on the internet. In the meantime, it'd be lovely to get to know you and hear where you're joining us from. So if you want to pop in the chat and tell us where you are today, that'd be lovely to see. I'm sitting here in the West End in Vancouver. It's a beautiful afternoon and the sunset's gorgeous here today, so that's where I am. So yeah, you can share in the chat where you're joining us from. Just a quick reminder about the chat settings. Hello Lois from North Vancouver, thanks for joining us. If you all want to make sure that everyone can see your messages, make sure that you're sending your chats to panelists and attendees, or to everyone. So there's a little button, there's a blue button in the chat. By default, it should say panelists only, so you'll see that a lot of you will start sending messages to only the panelists. But it'd be nice for everyone to see where you're joining us from. So if you can click on the button that says everyone, that'd be awesome. Hi Eric, hi Rose, thanks for joining us. Hi Allison. Sprout Lake, awesome place. Wendy from Manitoba, hi Wendy. Hi, Pippa and Penny in Victoria. Hi, Pippa. So I'm curious. Before we begin, we're gonna start this in about 2 minutes. For those of us who just joined, we're just waiting for people to trickle into the room. I'm curious. Has anyone read Clayton's book yet, or you're just anxiously waiting to read it? It came out on, I believe, August 24th, so it's very new. No. No takers yet. You have. Rose has read it. Oh, wonderful. Great. So, Rose, since you read it, I imagine that you will have some great questions for the Q&A. No pressure, but I hope you join and ask some questions in the Q&A. Great. Great to hear that people have it on hold at the library already. Awesome. So, just want to draw your attention to, we have a list of upcoming events that you can see there on a slide. That's tomorrow, Thursday, and next week. So this is the first event. Today's is the first event of this fall season of programming from the cultural programming team, and we have a bunch of stuff coming up. So please attend everything. I'm very excited about today, but also about what's happening tomorrow and on Thursday. So please join us. So we're gonna get started now. Hi everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Jorge Amigo. I'm the head of cultural programming for the Vancouver Public Library, and as you can tell, I'm your host for today. Now, my colleague Candy, who is also working the event, they'll be in the background making sure that everything runs smoothly. So please say hi to Candy in the chat. If you have any specific questions about the event, you can send it directly to the panelists. Please don't flood the entire chat for everyone with tech questions. Just send it to the panelists and we'll try to sort it out for you. Now, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are hosting this event from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And I want to encourage all of you to read and understand the history of this land and the people who have taken care of it for thousands of years, and what it means for you to be here. Now, if you're joining us from another part of the country or another part of the world, there's a great resource that Candy's going to share in the chat right now, so you can learn about the land where you live. Now, today's event is very special. We're here to listen and learn from two people who have been at the forefront of environmental issues in this country, witnessing, reporting, and sharing important stories. And we're also here to talk about an amazing memoir, which is full of powerful stories, and I encourage all of you to get it. And those of you who've already read it, you can probably agree with me that it's wonderful. So here's the book. We have it at the library as well if you want to check it out there or put a hole in it, but I really encourage you to also buy it if you are into getting books and writing all over them, which I am. Now, speaking of stories, we're excited to present this event in partnership with the Narwhal. Now, the Narwhal is a relatively new journalism organization based here in BC, for those of you who don't know, and they focus on environmental reporting, and they're publishing some of the most groundbreaking stories on climate change, environmental policy in this country. So Candy's going to share the link to the Narwhal right now. And I want you to know that the Narwhal is a pioneer of nonprofit journalism in Canada, which means that they're supported by more than 3,500 monthly members. So if you're the kind of person who's wondering how you can make a difference during the climate emergency, maybe you want to support the critical reporting. And I think there's two ways you can do that. And one is by signing up for their excellent newsletter, which will bring you up to speed of the most important environmental stories happening in our country. And the second way is you can become a member of the Narwhal with a monthly contribution. So if you go to the website, which we shared on the chat, you can do both of those things right on the website. You can sign up for their newsletter and you can sign up as a member. Now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce today's speakers. So please, Clayton, Sarah, can you please join me on stage? Hi.
Hello.
Nice to see you both. Clayton Thomas-Müller is a member of the Treaty 6 based Mathias Colomb Cree Nation located in Northern Manitoba. He's a campaigner for 350.org, one of the world's most important climate organizations, and has campaigned on behalf of Indigenous peoples around the world for more than 20 years. Now, throughout his work with numerous organizations, he has led Indigenous delegations to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN Earth Summit, and the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Sarah Cox is an award-winning journalist who covers energy and environmental politics for the Narwhal. In 2021, Sarah's investigative reporting on the Sept Dam won the World Press Freedom Prize and the Canadian Journalism Foundation's Jackman Award for Excellence in Journalism. So congratulations, Sarah. And also her 2018 book about the Sept Dam, it's called Reaching the Peace. That one won a BC Book Prize. And we also have it at the library, so you can read it there or buy your own copy. So Clayton, Sarah, great to have you here. Take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Jorge. I'm very honored to be moderating this event tonight, and I'm joining you from Victoria on the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. And I totally encourage you to get a copy of Clayton's book. It's just marvelous. It's beautiful and heartrending, but also a very hopeful memoir of healing and resilience. And the first thing I wanted to talk about tonight, I wanted to ask Clayton what his overall goal was, what his overarching goal was when he sat down to write this memoir. Clayton, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. First and foremost, though, Tanse, Boju, Zongibini, Sianene, Tishnakas, Kinutotem. As mentioned, I'm Clay. I live in Treaty 1 territory in the city of Winnipeg, home of the Great Métis Nation and so many First Nations, Anishinaabe, Oji Cree, Lakota, and Dakota. Yeah, just a huge expression of gratitude to everybody who's turned in tonight, as well as the Narwhal and, of course, the Vancouver Public Library. I really appreciate that institution, such a beautiful place in the world. I used to live in Vancouver. And of course, Sarah, for hosting tonight's event. And I want to acknowledge just this territory that I'm speaking to y'all from, Treaty 1 territory, and the ancestors that our great city of Winnipeg is built upon. And so, the goal of this book, gosh, this has been a 7-year project in the making. And, if you want to understand kind of how this is much more than a book, check out the website in the chat there, lifeinthecityofdirtywater.com, because what this project, the storytelling project, actually is a multi-dimensional, like a 3-dimensional storytelling universe. It's a transmedia project that includes a short documentary that premiered at Hot Docs a couple of years ago. It now lives on CBC Gem, has the same title as the memoir, Life in the City of Dirty Water. And COVID willing, once all of this quarantine and inability to travel and gather in person stops, I'm going to be doing a road show that includes over 40 video vignettes that aren't in the film or the book, but that expand upon the stories that I share in the memoir. There's just going to be a whole bunch of digital media content that folks will be able to access through their devices. I guess the core, though, of why I wrote this memoir is that about 7 years ago, I was having a real hard time. I'm a father. I got 2 sons, Felix and Jax, and I was having a really hard time doing like day-to-day father stuff. Same thing with being a husband. I kept finding myself turning into autopilot, especially when I was hanging out with my sons who were around 4 and 6 years old at the time. We were living in capital city in Ottawa. And, so I talked to my therapist that I was seeing at that time. And he said, oh, yeah, it's totally normal for, survivors of Indian residential school, or for the children of survivors of Indian residential school to, exhibit that kind of behavioral pattern. There's a lot of indicators to post-traumatic stress disorder, or, what natives call intergenerational residential school syndrome. And one of those indicators is this thing called dissociative behavior. He said, because you see, when you look at your boys at 4 and 6, they're a mirror to you. And so whatever you went through as far as trauma at that age, and whatever age they go up from here out, they're going to mirror back to you the things that you might have gone through at their age, and that triggers your fight or flight response. Which is the thing that controls things like your heartbeat or breathing. Some people call it your reptilian brain. It's the thing that wakes you up when you fall asleep by the campfire and your sleeping bag catches fire, and so it's really hard to fix that. So I said, well, shoot, what do I do about it, man? And he's like, well, start writing about it, maybe, keep going to Sundance and Sweat Lodge and smoke your pipe and eat healthy and exercise, do some art, but yeah, start writing about it. And so I did. And the book that I wrote about was way too fucked up to publish. It, would have really hurt a lot of people that I care about and that I'm still on this journey of life with. And so instead I took a step back and I talked to a videographer friend of mine who helped me. I said, I want to kind of do this in the native way, in a non-written language way, an oral history way. And, maybe we could just spend some time over the next, while, and you could record me talking about what it's like to grow up native in Canada, in one of Canada's inner cities. And he was really down for the project. Shout out to Spencer Mann in Toronto. And so we started out about 7 years ago on this project. And by the time we were done, about 150 hours of recording stories, we put the audio through Google Voice to Text, and it spit out a manuscript that we then edited into the existing memoir that's available in stores and online all across the planet. So yeah, it was a big personal kind of healing project, but also I think more than that, more than just a pathway to becoming more present in the moment, practicing mindfulness, so that I could be a better father to my sons. And, it was also about creating documenting my life and the things that I had to overcome to get to this point now, where my boys are, they're flourishing, they get good grades, they speak multiple languages. And, the mother and I separated, unfortunately, but we're still best friends and co-parenting these little bears, as I call them. And, and this storytelling project was a gift to them and, whatever grandchildren that they might have down the road, so that they know exactly what their mushroom had to go through to, forge a new path. Yeah.
That's an incredible story, Clayton. And one thing that really struck me was that you signed the acknowledgements with your full name, Clayton George Thomas-Müller, Strong Thunderbird Man. I love that name. And the book talks about losing your childhood name and then finding it again at Sundance. And what was that like? And what does the name Strong Thunderbird Man mean to you?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. Got time for another book? No, I'm just joshing. Well, yeah, that as many challenges, the book starts with a foreword from my mother, my mother Gail. And with all the challenges that she had to go through as a single mother for the most part, she had me when she was 16, and we basically grew up together. She was still very much a child when I have memories of her being a toddler and stuff, going to movies and whatnot. And even though she was going to school and working full time and doing all this stuff that so many strong women do, when fathers aren't around, in the face of colonialism and surviving residential school, she still managed to expose me to a lot of culture, which, if you read the book, I talk a lot about how culture and language is the pathway to, self-determination, and being able to, make choices for yourself, in a good way. And so, yeah, she got me a name and my colors when I was just a little baby, from the late George Daniels from Long Plain. He's a very respected elder, but those colors and the name itself, it just kind of disappeared over the years, as we stopped going to so much cultural things and as challenges in life became overwhelming. And in my teenage years, when I started to grow into a young man, it was the culture itself and getting exposed to my first Sundance that I was able to acquire another name, Zongebene Sienene, Strong Thunderbird Man, and my clan is Eagle Clan, Canoe. And it's pretty crazy because later on I talked to that late elder's brother, Don Daniels, and right away he reminded me of my name that his brother gave me 20 years earlier, and it's pretty crazy. And it's both Thunderbird names. I can't share my first name because that's my birth name, but yeah, it's pretty wild, just the connection there. But for me, it's funny because I work with so many different types of people, personalities, very gifted individuals that when we're together, we're like some super robot that could take on Godzilla, right? And for me being Eagle Clan and also having a name, after the sacred thunder beings, I'm always like 60,000 feet in the sky, and I can see very far into the past and the future and what's currently happening right now across the battlegrounds. And the interest, I guess the one thing I'll share about the thunder beings is that, they represent healing. They represent the end of winter. They always come back in the spring, and they represent the beginning of the seasons of abundance, when there's food and, sacred gatherings, ceremony, berry picking, fishing, all of that good stuff when it comes back again. And, and the land gets healed by that rain and that lightning, of the thunder beings. And so, the role I play in my life is, I think, to provide, not just the teaching of unconditional love that Eagle Clan is responsible for, but also to play a part in bringing that healing energy back into our communities and our homes and our nations. That's the role of the Thunderbird, and the color that if people want to honor the thunder beings is purple. If you ever want to put cloth out or make some tobacco ties, they like that color purple, like Prince.
You so frankly talk about very difficult things like being bullied at school, mugging, stealing cars, going to court for break and enters, being in juvie, running a drug house in Winnipeg, and how you got out just in time. And can you take us back to that time in your life and talk about what gave you the strength and courage to leave that behind and to step forward in a different direction?
I gotta say it's people, people, relationships, a sense of belonging, community. I haven't always had that, and there might be moments in my future where I don't feel connected to community. That's the ebb and flow and the valleys and peaks, I think, of the human experience. But, I think our collective, shared traits as human beings is that, we seek out, companionship and community, a sense of belonging. When we have those things, we're healthy. A lot of people think sobriety is the antithesis to substance dependency, but really it's community and a sense of belonging. I mean, Dr. Gabriel Mate talks a lot about that stuff, and if y'all haven't checked him out and you're dealing with trauma, you should read some of his books. He's pretty badass. But yeah, for me, I think at a very young age, and this is common, in the Native community, a lot of Native folks I speak to from a very early age, they have to deal with death, and even to this day, I'm 44 now. I get so, it's almost like shamed or embarrassed, but there's just always so much bad stuff that happens in my extended family because of poverty and because of trauma. People die, they take their own lives, they die from whatever their addictions are, or they die from disease brought on by, unhealthy eating and lifestyle patterns due to, economic status, and or being cut off from their traditional lands and not being able to eat, in a native way. So many of us are diabetic and have autoimmune deficiency diseases or get cancer. Because we're only like 40 years from a traditional diet that didn't have all the sugars and the carbohydrates and stuff that they sell at the 7-Eleven now. We didn't have corn syrup. And so, for me at a young age, I just, I had a couple of people very close to me pass away. I write about it in the memoir, and just a lot of violence, growing up. Lived with a lot of domestic violence in my own household, and experienced a lot of sexual and spiritual violence as a child. And through a lot of that, it's not always those big traumatic moments that screw you up. Sometimes there's a straw that breaks the camel's back. And for me, when I was 14, my cousin Star passed away, and she was my best friend in the world, and she got killed by a drunk driver. And right around the same time, my best friend's older brother died in a car accident, and as well. And so we both kind of just made a death pact, and we're like, you know what, fuck, F the world. We're just going to do our own thing. And, I managed to get kicked out of every school in the little redneck town in northern BC I was living in, this town called Terrace. It's a pretty tough place to grow up in when you're a handsome, skinny Cree boy from Winnipeg. If I wasn't scrapping with the racist white kids, it was the big native Nishka guys and Shimshan guys that were giving me a hard time because I looked different. But what I found though, every time that things got really bad through my teenage years, where I was, getting arrested, doing bad things, not going to school, and just kind of being real wild, acting out because of the frustration that I carried about having no control to help people that I love. It was always really, really healthy, positive Indigenous folks that spoke the language, or that were attached to the culture. I remember I got a bunch of community work service hours, and the cop that arrested me had another RCMP officer that ran sweat lodges twice a week, and they set it up so I could do my community work service hours, just being the firekeeper for this old Blackfoot Elders sweat lodge in Terrace. And so even though I was getting in all kinds of shit, I was still twice a week going and helping this old man, with bring the rocks into his sweat lodge and, help people heal. And I got to go into the sweats all the time. So there was always the unseen face of our ancestors guiding me to, guiding good people into my life to kind of bring me back onto the path and continue my journey until eventually, after finding myself, involved in crime and, right to the point where I was working for my brothers in the Manitoba Wars and running a drug house, there was a big intervention. A lot of people came at me at once and encouraged me to do something better with my life. And so I got involved in inner city programs for at-risk youth and managed to, acquire my GED and start a youth organization, the first one of its kind in the country. It's called Aboriginal Youth With Initiative. My friends and I from the Native Youth Movement started it. And, within a year, we had 14 staff doing gang intervention work and, intervening in young people's lives in the inner city, trying to help them decolonize and get away from exposure to gang culture and, and open doorways and pathways to being exposed to the language and to ceremony. Because that's what helped, every one of us in the Native Youth Movement was the ceremonies. And that's what put us onto the pathway. What some people call the Red Road, other people call the movement. But just that beauty way. And so, and I've been on that road ever since. I mean, I have swayed from it for sure, and probably will again. This book is certainly not I'm like that guy in the ribbon shirt with the feather, like all super tradish. I'm just a guy from Winnipeg, trying to get by and trying to be responsible. So, yeah.
You've had incredible experiences that you detail in the book, working with Indigenous peoples in the Navajo Nation in Alaska and Mexico, throughout Canada. And you say something that really stuck out for me. You say that nothing is local. I'm wondering what you mean by that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
You have to expand a little bit, like on the context of that question. Nothing like.
Just, I think it was when you were talking about your original experiences in Mexico, and just being in Mexico and having your eyes open to what Indigenous peoples in Mexico were dealing with. And you the point in the book in which you say nothing is local, and then you go on to make all the connections between what's going on in Mexico and what is happening in Indigenous communities in Canada. I'm just wondering if you can elaborate on that a little bit, about the connectivity of all of that and the shared experiences despite the geographical distance.
Yeah, I mean, like that's the whole thing that's pretty incredible about the forced transition off of the analog era of technology into the digital era of technology and information, and is that people now, including people in the movement, can share and exchange experience and information at the speed of light. I mean, my friend Van Jones in the States talks about the phone when he gives speeches, and he says there's more computing power in this little thing than there was in the computers that they used to send humankind to the moon, right in the palm of my 12-year-old Jackson's hand. And so, it's pretty incredible, what children are exposed to now. And I think the reference that you're talking about, when I was young and I was, I went down to Mexico and marched with the Zapatistas, with a bunch of other young people from the inner city here in Winnipeg, young Indigenous peoples, is that the project, of colonialism and, European nations' imperial expansion across Mother Earth, and just this big competition that happened to see who could scoop up the most, land for extractivism and, souls for, taxes for the church and the kings and the queens that all endorsed this big, massive expansion colonialism project. There are indicators that come with colonialism and settler occupation and gunboat diplomacy and trauma and, classism and all the things that Westerners brought, to Turtle Island, over the last two millennia or whatever, as long as people have been coming over. Because we all know, if y'all still think it was Columbus that discovered this place, I mean, there were Africans coming here like 700 years before Columbus. The Maori were coming up here 1,000 years ago. People from Asia, it's pretty wild, this colonial project. And but it's also pretty wild, the similarities between around dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands and the practices that are used by settler colonial state, whether it's the military apparatus or gunboat diplomacy, like starving people by not giving them food rations, biological warfare through, actions like the distribution of smallpox blankets during treaty negotiations back in the day. It wasn't guns that killed Native people in Canada. It was smallpox and polio and what's that lung one?
Tuberculosis.
Tuberculosis. These are the things that they put our children in ghetto ass situations with no kind of sanitation, and they all got sick and died. And I mean, the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, I'm always amazed, where Chief Dan George comes from. I'm always amazed by that story. They got down to like 29 members of their nation, but everybody died. And now they're like one of the most powerful forces on the geopolitics of Mother Earth in the fight to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline. which would go right to their port there in the Burrard Inlet, and and have affected the national discourse and psyche. That one family, the George family. So I think that's what I mean. That when I talk about this memoir, Life in the City of Dirty Water, yes, it's my story, but it's the story of so many Indigenous peoples. Just like any Native person, if you're non-Native, has this story. They just might express it differently.
In reference to one of your visits to the Southwest US, you write, "The plundering of the land is the plundering of the people. When the land is polluted, the people are polluted." Why are Indigenous rights and climate justice movements and environmental movements inextricably intertwined?
Well, big shout out to all those Dene down there in Navajo territory and all the other Southwest tribe peoples. It's crazy, like when you look at the old stories, like I'll never forget learning about the creation story of the Dene people, and the story about Changing Woman and the Hero Twins. Google those things. It's too long to talk about in this interview, but yeah, Changing Woman and the Hero Twins. The Hero Twins were given these powerful weapons to kill these massive monsters that were walking the earth and terrorizing the human beings. And so Spirit gave these twins, this is a condensed and super short version. They gave them these super weapons, these arrows made of this super weapon, and the Changing Twins, they killed those beasts, and then they were told to put that weapon deep into the earth, and it was never to be taken out of the earth again. And it's crazy. Now you look at the legacy of uranium mining and uranium testing in the Southwest, and the fact that the bomb for Hiroshima and Nagasaki came from, the Navajo mines, and the thousands of families that had moms and dads and grandparents and aunties and uncles die from cancer from working in those mines with no supports, no water, no whatever. And that's the thing, like no matter which nation you go to across Canada or the United States or other similar settler colonial occupied territories that have a strong foundation population of Indigenous peoples, you'll see that the most toxic industries, the most destructive, high CO2, high toxicity industries are adjacent to Indigenous communities. And, this is by design. It's part of the neo-colonial project, the extension and continuation of past, colonial policies, genocidal policies. And, the story is the same here in Canada. Everywhere, every community you look at, 630 plus First Nations, dozens of Inuit hamlets, and in the Arctic circumpolar region, Inuit hamlets, and then in the Arctic circumpolar region, Métis hamlets, and then in the circumpolar region, you got Inuit hamlets. And, these are the places where massive gold mines, diamond mines, open pit mines that destroy water, offshore drilling and extraction, the tar sands, pipelines proposed to go to every corner, every ocean port of the continent from the world's largest industrial project in the history of humankind. They still want to build coal mines, for crying out loud, during this era of the climate emergency. And if you overlay a map of all the Indigenous communities in Canada and all those toxic industries that destroy water, earth, and climate, and food security, and all those, human health that stomp on human rights and Indigenous rights, you'll see that environmental racism in this country is very much a red and white issue. That's not to say that there aren't poor, Black, communities of color and even white communities that are impacted by environmental injustices. But for the large majority of Canada's GDP, it's based on the ongoing dispossession of Indigenous peoples from our lands, the urbanization of those populations, the ghettoization of the communities in those urban centers, underservicing, no safety net. And it is a ongoing injustice. And so, for me, one of the teachings that I learned growing up was the story about the wolf. And, when Creator sent Wisege Jack in the Cree culture, or Nanabushu in the Ojibwe culture across Turtle Island to name all of creation, they got lonely, and they asked Creator, hey, can you give us a friend to hang out with while we do this big job you've asked of us? And Creator said, yeah, sure. So the Creator made Wolf, and Wolf traveled with Nana Boju or Wisege Jack, depending on which way you're looking at it. And they were brothers, and they named all the animals, all the plants and medicines and foods and waters and mountains and everything. And when Nana Boju or Wisege Jack's, job was done, this trickster, Creator said, well, Mayangan, the wolf, is going to go on their own now. They're going to do their own thing, build their nation. But forever from this point, whatever happens to Mayangan will happen to the Anishinaabe or the new, depending on which language and lens you're looking at it through. And so, and that is the truth. And we see that in every community where industry is running rampant and operating without any kind of, ridicule or overview or following any environmental laws. Indigenous peoples have cancer spikes, they have autoimmune diseases, they have horrible living conditions or boil water advisories. And, this is not circumstantial, it's by design.
We've just had a $610 million federal election in the midst of a pandemic that's left us with essentially the same government that we had before the election. I'm wondering what your initial thoughts are about that, and whether you see hope in addressing some of these issues such as environmental racism and climate policy, and normalizing conversations about the difficult issues that you touch on in your book. Where do we stand now, less than 24 hours after our federal election?
Yeah, this is a really frustrating one, and I'm sure people in BC can relate after what y'all just went through, with Horgan and the election over there and all that stuff. And, it's really challenging. I think one of the main things that I would say about this election and the government coming out of this election, this minority government, is that it's easy, to endorse a plan that puts us on track to a 4% Celsius warming when you're experiencing climate change as an academic. But for our Native people, in our communities across Canada, or so-called Canada and the United States and around the world, especially in circumpolar regions, Justin Trudeau's plan is at best an eviction notice from our lands that we've lived on for generations. And, at worst, it's a death sentence for our people and culture. It's a huge expansion on what former Senator and Judge Murray Sinclair defined the Indian residential school policy, as cultural genocide. We now know that, they were, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had all kinds of conditions imposed on it by the federal government so that they could not just flat out call it genocide, Indian residential schools, that, Murray Sinclair talked about in response to the identification of all of these mass, unmarked graves of children who were murdered during residential school, thousands of them. I think we're past 6,000 at this point of our little ones that are finally finding their way home. But yeah, this government's, flippant kind of like, new form of climate denialism is of grave concern for myself. And I think voters across the country, we're dealing with a global triple threat that is really impacting people's psychology, the fabric of their family and communities and their own psyche. this global triple threat of the COVID pandemic, economic recession unlike anything we've ever seen, and of course the existential threat of climate change. If Canada is going to do what it takes to tackle the climate emergency, we need a plan to get off of fossil fuels, bottom line. And it's not like Native people or eco-fascists or environmentalists or hippies or whatever, hipsters or whatever you want to call the environmental movement, or people, the movement of people who are concerned about climate justice. It's leading institutions on the planet. It's the interpanel, climate on climate change, the IPCC. It's the International Energy Agency, one of the most conservative global energy advisory bodies on the planet. They were best friends with the Canadian government up until they said that Canada needs to shut down the tar sands immediately. I mean, it's the UN Secretary General. It's Canada's own energy, national energy regulator have all said that we don't need the Trans Mountain pipeline. And during the election, Minister Wilkinson announced that they were going to be running the Trans Mountain, if they were successful in building it, till 2060, which is like a decade after Canada commits to being net zero, and decades after the world's leading scientists in their consensus, have said that all economies, including Canada, need to be weaned off of fossil fuels. And so, it's a joke. Basically nothing's changed. The government, this was politicizing, really substantial issues that humankind is facing, but not equally, disproportionately. Certain sectors of our society, including Indigenous peoples and rural peoples, are experiencing it in a much worse way. And so, for us, at 350.org, we were hammering the federal government before the writ drop on, this promise that Justin Trudeau made to pass the Just Transition Act. We won that campaign. When what's his name? O'Regan, the Irish minister, Seamus O'Ryan. I always forget his last name. Anyway, what is it?
I think it was Regan.
Yeah, Regan. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dude announced right before the writ drop that they were starting a consultation process on a Just Transition Act, for workers and communities impacted by the transition off of fossil fuels. And so that was a big victory for us. And, coming out of this election, we've got a couple of demands on that. And, we are certainly going to be working, with everybody that was activated during the election, this climate election, the one of two remaining elections we have left in the 8.5 years that we have to respond to the IPCC, who says we've got a decade to get off of fossil fuel. And, so for us, we're calling for a Just Transition Act here in Canada that leaves no one behind. And that means, basing this in three principles. And those are guaranteed good green union jobs, putting people first. So a just transition can't be another excuse to hand billions of dollars to big oil. These companies got to pay to clean up their messes. And we need to know that both climate change and the transition disproportionately impacts Indigenous rural communities, and that that's where the most support is going to need to go at the very beginning of this process. And it all needs to align with climate scientists, and I keep saying that to people. It's not Indigenous communities or the environmental movement that are saying we need to get off of big oil in every sector of our economy. These are the leading scientific bodies of government policy advising bodies on Mother Earth that are saying this stuff. And it's just the politicians at this point that continue to, like I said, be flippant in their reaction in terms of the scale that we need to be addressing the existential threat of the climate emergency at.
I want to open things up to questions in a minute, but first, Clayton, I wanted to ask you one more question. You talked about the post-traumatic stress syndrome that you were experiencing as the son of residential school survivors. Residential schools were much in the media before the federal election, much less so now. Your mother spent 7 years in residential school, starting at the age of 6. You talk about how your father went to residential school at the age of 5, and how other family members are survivors as well. And I'm wondering if there can ever be healing from the violence of residential schools and colonialism.
Absolutely. But the Trudeau government continues to put the cart before the horse, as did his predecessor, the Harper government. They've never taken this seriously. White supremacy is still, a significant issue systemically in these lands that they call Canada. We do need to take a significant step back. The federal government continues, in partnership with governments like the Horgan government, to terrorize Indigenous communities with the utilization of the National Police apparatus, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and working in collusion with local police departments to terrorize Indigenous women and children. You look at what's happening right now in the Blue River watershed with the Tiny House Warriors. This is an encampment of members of the Secwepemc Nation. They have no agreements with the federal crown over title with their lands. There is court cases for nations in BC, in particular the Chilcotin, that have proven that title continues to reside in the hands of BC First Nations. And yet, you look at circumstances like in Blue River that are occurring right now, and pre-COVID pandemic shutdown. You look at the call to shut down Canada by Wet'suwet'en, women and clan houses who title sits with in that region, and children from that region. When the RCMP were called in there to raid perfectly legal hunting camps, to try and make way for the Coastal GasLink project, an massive LNG export terminal plan that infects the entire of northern so-called British Columbia. They had like AR-15s fully automatic machine guns pointed at Indigenous women and children in that raid. And the story has been the same for decades and decades and decades. For me, I'm very disgusted, and continue to be very disgusted and very disempowered at times. When I see things like I lived in the capital for over a decade, and I'll never forget that it was during the Attawapiskat Chief Teresa Spence protest against De Beers, I think it's De Beers Mining Company up there, and the destruction of all their plumbing and flooding of all their homes with sewage by the mining company. And then Teresa Spence, it was during Idle No More, I think December 2012. They couldn't clean up the water mess up in that community of Attawapiskat. But I remember that year they built, I think it was like $20 million they spent on these fancy ass shelters on the Rideau Canal, where you could just to change your ice skates. And I was like, where's the logic in this? They could fix this situation in Attawapiskat for $8 million, $10 million bucks, I bet. But no, we need to make sure there's fancy Norman Rockwell looking, ice skate changing facilities on the Rideau Canal. It was absolutely mind boggling. And so, for me, I think about all these children that are coming home and, finally, and I think about, what my own family sacrificed, because of this policy. And I think about the fact that a lot of information about systemic racism and colonialism that Canada endorses, and even a lot of and I'm straight up calling out, I'm not mentioning any names, but a lot of the Native people out there that are part of the liberal machinery, they only lift up solutions and content and curriculum that caters to addressing white liberal guilt, and it's not actually about activating, deconstructing racism and patriarchy, toxic masculinity, all the things that make our society totally screwed up. No, it's about, making people feel a little bit better about the past. And that's where the apology from Stephen Harper back in the day was totally ass backwards. Like, we need to be talking about reparations first and foremost. We need to address the wound, the gaping shotgun wound in the hearts of Indigenous peoples by the settler colonial state of Canada. We need to do triage on that and heal that, let them recover, make sure they do it in a comfortable way. And we need to invest, in Indigenous communities, because they live in the places that provide the economic basis for the entire Canadian economic engine. These are the places where they live, where resources are extracted. And if we're going to move forward together, Canada can continue to look forward to the same kind of just really bad feeling about our collective shared past. And I'm talking to non-Native people when I say this as well. Until we flip that apology backwards and begin a conversation about reparations, about land back. That's what Indigenous peoples are calling reparations, the land back movement. We're going to keep having the kinds of problems that we have. I think former chief Arthur Manuel said it best. He said, you got to stop crying on the shoulder of the guy who stole your land. And he talks about in his book, less than 1% of total land that Indigenous peoples occupied pre-colonialism, that we took care of pre-colonialism for millennia, since Creator put us here, less than 1% is under our control. And that's why we continue to experience the worst impacts of poverty, the socioeconomic outcomes of poverty. Not poverty really, but just being cash broke, not having land, not having equity. And residential school never really ended. Like, there are more Native kids living in care of state-sponsored child welfare agencies in this country, being cared for by non-Native social workers, non-Native families, than there were in 150 years of residential school genocide policy. And so we've got a long way to go, a lot of work to do. I encourage people to get politicized and activated. Start with small steps, and then you can work towards those running leaps, in your pathway to support the movement, to get on that red road and, fight the good fight, and, decolonize the minds of our children, teach our young boys, to reject this toxic colonial patriarchy, white supremacy, messed up BS that so many of us were indoctrinated with growing up in the past, and teach our young people to be accepting, of everybody, no matter what gender they identify with, sexuality they identify with, no matter what color they are. But that's going to be a multi-generational project, just like the Green New Deal. Getting off of fossil fuel is going to be a multi-set suite of legislative measures. There's not going to be one bill that changes our economy. It's going to be like 8 or 9 bills all pieced together. But it's going to take, people power, a people-powered movement, people hitting the streets and stopping business as usual, to force politicians like Justin Trudeau and the rest of the Grits and whoever they're going to use to maintain balance of power in this new minority government. We got to hit them hard. We got to hit them starting tomorrow.
Clayton, there's so many more things I want to ask you about, but I'm mindful of the time, and I do want to open things up to questions. So I'm going to invite participants to drop some questions into the Q&A. It's just down, if you look at the right-hand side of your screen, the bottom right-hand side, you can see Q&A, and you can drop any questions you have for Clayton in there, please. If there are no questions, I have plenty more. And I'll just wait one more second and see if anybody has anything in the Q&A or the chat. I'm not seeing anything in either. one of the things I was curious about, Clayton, was the title of the book, which when I first picked it up, Life in the City of Dirty Water, I immediately thought about the drinking water, the potable water crisis in First Nations communities. And it was only later on that I learned it actually comes from the Indigenous word for Winnipeg, which of course is a place that is very central in your life. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you chose the name for the book.
That's a real funny story. When we were reporting when we were promoting the film a couple years back, I could tell which one of my friends actually read the description of the film and which ones were just hit and share, because they would be like, "Oh, check out this new environmental movie about boil water advisories," because they just assumed it was that. But no, Life in the City of Dirty Water is just like the literal translation of Winnipeg, which in Cree means muddy water or murky water. Winnipeg is built right at the nexus point of the mighty Red River and of course the Assiniboine River. And in the heart of the city, there's a place called the Forks, which is kind of this really cute little tourism area, lots of restaurants and whatnot. But it's been a gathering place for thousands of years of Indigenous peoples, who would gather there in the summertime to trade and have powwow, and, share food. And so yeah, Life in the City of Dirty Water is specifically about, it just means it's just the city where I live and that I love so much.
Thank you. And I think we need to wrap now. It's 3 minutes to 8. And I just wanted to say, Clayton, thank you so much for all your generosity during this interview and for sharing a little bit of your remarkable journey with us. And thank you to Vancouver Public Library for hosting. Thank you to everybody who participated from all over the place. And I also want to give a big plug for this book. If you can afford to buy it, please go out and buy it. If you can't afford to buy it, the libraries have copies. When you buy books, you support authors, you support the Canadian publishing industry. If you can't afford to buy it, please do. It's on the numerous bestseller lists right now, and it's an absolutely fantastic, riveting, heartrending, and ultimately hopeful read. So thank you so much, Clayton, and good night, everybody. Have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. I just want to also say real quick too, if you're not a reading type, you can also check out on literally every platform that sells books online, although I encourage you to, order books to your locally owned bookstore. That's always the best thing to do rather than order it straight from Amazon. Although I know some of y'all got kids, you're busy, so do your best. But there's also the audiobook available. It's read by me. So, I animate a lot of the characters, that I talk about. So check that out. If you're not into buying books, you can get the audiobook, listen to it on your drive or your run. And yeah, thank you so much. Big shout out to everybody in Vancouver, especially, all of my friends. And, a big shout out to Anjali, Vancouver Granville. They're still counting the votes in that race. All my prayers to Anjali and her campaign team. Just the most dynamic and exciting, campaign, I think, in this entire federal Canadian election. So yeah, thank you so much, Vancouver Public Library, and to the Narwhal, and to you, Sarah, for having me this evening.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Good night, everybody.
Thank you too for joining us, for being here with us tonight. It was wonderful to hear you speak. Again, thank you for explaining all the ways that people can get your book, and the audiobook sounds awesome. I have a copy here. I want to echo what Sarah said. Go buy it if you can. It's fantastic. If not, we have copies at the library. And for all of you who arrived late, or if people who weren't able to join, this event is being live streamed to our Facebook page, so you can go check it out on our Facebook page afterwards. It's going to live there for a while, forever maybe. Candy's going to share the link to where you can find that video right now. So the other thing is, we're a public institution, which means that we do programs that work for you. So your feedback is really important to us. So we would love it if you filled out a quick survey. It takes about 2 minutes to fill out, and basically it will allow you to tell us how we did with this event, and so that we can keep putting on awesome things for you. So it's going to be there, the link on the chat as well. Now, if you enjoyed your time tonight with us, I want to briefly tell you about two events happening this week. You already saw them on a slide that Candy's going to share as well. But tomorrow night, we're hosting an event about the return of the Fire Dragon Festival to Vancouver. So since the 70s, the Fire Dragon Festival hasn't been celebrated in Vancouver, so it's coming back. And so we're doing an event just to talk about what that means and what the festival is about and all the traditions there. So come learn about this celebration. That's tomorrow at 7 p.m. Vancouver time. And then on Thursday, we're going to host a British literary sensation, Max Porter. And he's going to be joining us all the way from England to chat with Dorothy Wooden from the Tyee. And he wrote a very interesting book about what the last 6 days of the life of the painter Francis Bacon were like. So he gets into the brain of Francis Bacon and tries to speculate what he was thinking in his deathbed. So if you're a fan of speculative fiction or that kind of interesting work, join us, and that's on Thursday. So that's all I have for today. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks for coming. We hope to see you at the rest of our events. We're going to keep this event open for about 5 minutes after all of us leave the stage. And that's just so that you can go through the chat and click on links, say goodbye to each other, etc. So bye for now. I'm going to get off the screen, but it'll be on for 5 more minutes. Thanks everyone. Thanks Sarah. Thanks Clayton. Thanks to the audience. Ciao.